Before the Aztec Empire rose, before cities of stone gleamed on the waters of Lake Texcoco, there were only the gods and the stories told in whispers around sacred fires. To understand the Aztecs, you must first drift back into those myths, where time itself moved in great cycles and creation was never permanent. According to their lore, the world was not made once, but many times. Each creation was a sun, an age that rose and fell, destroyed by flood, by jaguars, by fire, or by wind. Again and again, the gods began the world anew, and again it ended in catastrophe. In the darkness after the last destruction, the gods gathered in Teotihuacan, the holy place of creation. There they lit the fifth sun, the age in which the Aztecs themselves would live. But the sun was weak. It refused to move across the sky. The gods debated. How could they set it in motion? At last they agreed that one of them must sacrifice himself, and so Nanahuatzin, a humble and disfigured god, leapt into the fire, his body consumed, his spirit transformed into the blazing sun. The other gods followed, giving their blood so that the sun might rise. From that moment, the Aztecs believed, the universe depended on sacrifice. Without offerings of blood and life, the sun would falter, the world would end, and darkness would swallow creation once more. It was into this sacred worldview that the Mexica people were born. They called themselves Mexica, though history would later call them Aztecs, after the land of Aztlan, their legendary homeland. No one knows exactly where Aztlan lay. Some said it was an island far to the north, others imagined it as a paradise of reeds and waters. What mattered was not the geography, but the story, that the Mexica were a chosen people, guided by the will of their god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the god of war and the sun. Imagine them now, wandering across valleys and deserts, carrying the idol of Huitzilopochtli upon a litter, his voice heard through the priests who served him. Their journey was long, filled with hardship. They passed through lands already rich with cities, Toltecs, Tepanecs, and other Nahua peoples with palaces and temples. Compared to them, the Mexica were poor, ragged, and often despised. They were mercenaries, offering their spears to stronger powers in exchange for food or land. Yet they carried with them the certainty of destiny, for Huitzilopochtli had promised them a home. The sign they were told to seek was clear: an eagle, perched on a cactus devouring a serpent. When they found this omen, they would know that their wandering was over, and that their empire would rise. For decades they searched. Some say they settled briefly in places where the sign seemed almost right, only to be driven out again. Other times, they were forced into swamps and inhospitable lands by stronger neighbors who feared or scorned them. In one story, they attempted to marry into the royal line of Culhuacan, a nearby city of noble ancestry, but the alliance ended in betrayal and bloodshed. Banished once more, the Mexica became hardened wanderers, their identity forged not in comfort but in struggle. Still, their God guided them. Still, they carried the sacred promise. At last, around the year 1325, their journey brought them to the basin of Lake Texcoco. The lake spread wide, dotted with islands, its shores lined with established city-states. Here, in the shimmering waters, the prophecy revealed itself. On a small marshy island, the Mexica beheld the sign: an eagle, wings spread wide, perched upon a cactus that grew from a stone, clutching a serpent in its beak. It was a vision of power, of survival, of triumph against odds. This, their priests declared, was the place. This was where they would build their city. And so, amid reeds and waterfowl, on an island no one else desired, the Mexica planted the first stakes of what would become Tenochtitlan. It was humble at first: reed huts, wooden walkways, soil piled upon woven mats to create the beginnings of chinampas, floating gardens anchored in the shallow lake. But the vision was larger than the reality. They believed the gods had chosen them. They believed their struggles had purpose. And so, though the land was poor, they transformed it into the foundation of greatness. As you picture this in your mind, imagine the shimmering surface of Lake Texcoco at dusk, the waters reflecting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a small band of wanderers, weary but determined, gathering reeds, digging into the mud, laying down roots on uncertain ground. Behind them lies centuries of wandering. Before them lies an empire. But in this first chapter of their story, what mattered most was belief. The Mexica saw themselves not simply as survivors, but as participants in a cosmic drama. Their god had demanded struggle, had demanded sacrifice, had demanded patience until the sign was shown. And now the sign had been seen, the eagle, the cactus, the serpent. These were not only omens of a city, but symbols of an identity, one that would endure even after the empire itself was gone. That image, once glimpsed by weary travelers on the lake, still lives today, centuries later, emblazoned on the flag of modern Mexico. A reminder of beginnings, of myth and destiny, of how a people forged from hardship rose to build one of the most astonishing civilizations the world has ever seen. As you drift deeper into rest, hold that picture in your mind. The eagle poised in triumph, the cactus rooted in stone, the serpent in its beak, a symbol born of myth, guiding wanderers to their home. The Mexica had found their place. Their journey as an empire was about to begin. When the Mexica first drove their stakes into the marshes of Lake Texcoco, they were not yet an empire, not yet feared or admired. They were still wanderers, a people of uncertain standing, mocked and mistrusted by the greater powers that surrounded them. Yet within that fragile beginning, the seeds of greatness were planted. The Valley of Mexico in the 14th century was not empty. It was a crowded mosaic of city-states, each with its own rulers, temples, markets, and ambitions. To the east stood Texcoco, a city of poets and engineers. To the west lay Azcapotzalco, the Tepanec stronghold, powerful and wealthy. To the south, Culhuacan boasted a noble lineage, tracing its ancestry back to the Toltecs, whose ancient ruins still inspired awe. Against these mighty neighbors, the Mexica seemed insignificant, a small tribe clinging to a patch of swamp. They were poor, yes, but they were not idle. On their chinampas, floating gardens woven of reeds and mud, they cultivated maize, beans, squash, and chilies. Their canoes glided along canals carrying fish and waterfowl. Slowly their settlement grew more stable, more permanent. Tenochtitlan began to take shape, not as a city of splendor, but as a community bound together by faith and survival. Still, the Mexica could not ignore their neighbors. To live in the valley was to be entangled in the politics of war and tribute. At times, they offered their spears as mercenaries, fighting on behalf of the Tepanecs or other city-states, earning both coin and experience. Their skill in battle became their greatest resource. The Mexica were fierce, disciplined, and willing to endure hardship traits that made them valuable allies, even as others looked down on them as upstarts. One story tells of how the Mexica sought marriage ties with Culhuacan to raise their prestige. They asked for a noblewoman, the daughter of a Culhua ruler, to become the bride of their god Huitzilopochtli. But when the girl was delivered to them, they sacrificed her instead, offering her heart to the sun. To the Mexica, this was devotion. To the Culhua, it was outrage. Enraged, they drove the Mexica from their lands. Once again, the wanderers were cast out, scorned and bloodied. Yet exile only hardened them. It was in these trials, in the humiliations of rejection, that the Mexica forged their resolve. They would not remain servants forever. They would endure, they would grow strong, and one day they would rule. By the mid-1300s, Tenochtitlan was no longer a fragile camp, but a village rising into a town. Wooden huts gave way to stone houses. Simple shrines grew into temples. Leaders emerged, chosen not only for noble birth but for cunning, bravery, and favor with the gods. The Mexica developed a council to guide their affairs, priests to interpret omens, and warriors to defend their growing territory. Their society took shape in layers. At the top stood the nobles and priests, guardians of tradition and interpreters of the divine. Below them were the commoners, the farmers, artisans, and fishers who sustained the community. And at the bottom were slaves, war captives, or debtors who labored but could sometimes earn their freedom. It was not yet the vast hierarchy of an empire, but the outlines were visible. The Mexica also embraced their role as outsiders. They adopted traditions from others, the calendar systems, the rituals, the art styles, yet reshaped them into their own. They claimed descent from the Toltecs, weaving themselves into the fabric of sacred history, asserting that though they were new, they were also heirs to the grandeur of the past. Still, survival was never easy. Surrounded by stronger city-states, the Mexica often had to tread carefully, paying tribute, making alliances, and waiting for their moment. That moment came when they aligned themselves with Azcapotzalco, the Tepanec capital. The Tepanecs were the dominant force in the valley, feared for their armies and respected for their wealth. By serving them as warriors, the Mexica gained protection and opportunity. It was during this period that the Mexica began to rise in reputation. They proved themselves indispensable on the battlefield. Their warriors returned with captives, fueling the sacrifices demanded by their god. Their prestige grew, and with it, their confidence. Though still tributaries, they were no longer dismissed as swamp dwellers. And all the while, Tenochtitlan grew. Canals crisscrossed the island. Causeways connected it to the mainland, making it less isolated. The Chinampas expanded, feeding an ever-growing population. From a distance, other city-states began to take notice. What had once been a marginal settlement was becoming a city with ambition. Yet even as they grew, the Mexica never forgot their beginnings. The memory of exile, of rejection, of humiliation at the hands of Culhuacan and others stayed alive in their stories. They carried it like a scar and like a spark. They believed their struggles proved that they were chosen by the gods. Hardship was not a curse but preparation. Each defeat was a step toward destiny. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the early Tenochtitlan, an island city just beginning, its wooden canoes moving quietly across the lake, its people tending to gardens that floated on water. Picture the marshes alive with birds, the mountains rising beyond the valley, the night sky reflected in the calm surface of the lake. It was a fragile world, but one filled with promise. The wanderers had become settlers. Their god had shown them the sign, and now they had built a home upon it. Yet they were not content to remain small. Already the ambition for more stirred in their hearts. They would rise higher, fight harder, and claim their place among the powers of the valley. For now, though, Tenochtitlan was still young, still vulnerable, still finding its place. But the Mexica knew that destiny had brought them here, and with each passing year, their city grew stronger, their people more determined, their future closer at hand. From the moment the Mexica chose their marshy island home, they faced a challenge: how to transform reeds and mud into a city worthy of the gods. The land was poor, the soil soft, the waters of Lake Texcoco surrounding them on all sides, yet necessity breeds invention, and faith fuels determination. With patience and ingenuity, the Mexica began to shape a metropolis from the very waters that seemed to hem them in. The first great innovation was the Chinampa, the floating garden. Imagine it. Layers of reeds and soil woven into rectangular plots, anchored by willow trees that sank their roots into the shallow lake bed. These gardens were fertile, producing harvest after harvest of maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers. Year by year, more Chinampas appeared, stretching like emerald rafts upon the water, feeding the growing population. Where once hunger haunted them, now abundance blossomed. As the Chinampas multiplied, so too did the city itself. The Mexica built canals between them, waterways that served as streets. Canoes glided through these liquid avenues, carrying produce to markets, people to temples, and warriors to their duties. Bridges of wood and stone connected different quarters of the city, while causeways stretched outward to the mainland, making Tenochtitlan less an island of isolation and more a hub of movement and trade. At the heart of the city rose the sacred precinct. Here stone replaced reeds, and the first great temples began to take shape. Towering above them all was the pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Twin shrines stood atop its summit, their steps steep, their meaning profound. The Mexica would forever balance the powers of war and sustenance, of blood and water, of conquest and survival. Around this sacred heart, palaces began to rise, homes of nobles and priests who guided the community. Markets spread out, their stalls brimming with food, cloth, obsidian blades, and brightly feathered crafts. Artisans carved statues of gods and rulers, weavers spun cotton into fine garments, and scribes painted codices that preserved stories, histories, and rituals in brilliant colors. What had begun as a fragile camp of reed huts was now becoming a city of stone and ceremony. Tenochtitlan was more than a place to live. It was a vision, a statement of identity. Every causeway, every canal, every chinampa was proof that the Mexica could bend nature to their will, that their god's prophecy had not been in vain. They were no longer wanderers or mercenaries. They were builders, engineers, and creators of something enduring. But life in Tenochtitlan was not without structure or order. As the city grew, so too did its social fabric. Nobles, or pipiltin, guided governance and war. Commoners, the Macahualtin, farmed the chinampas, built canals, and filled the markets. Slaves, or tlacotin, worked in households or fields, though they could sometimes buy freedom. Priests watched the skies, tracked the sacred calendar, and ensured the rituals that sustained the sun. Warriors trained constantly, for every able-bodied man was expected to serve, not only to defend the city, but to capture enemies for sacrifice. For the Mexica, religion was not separate from daily life. Every harvest, every building, every victory was tied to the will of the gods. The temples that rose in the city were not merely monuments, they were lifelines to the divine. Sacrifices offered atop their pyramids were not acts of cruelty, but acts of survival, gifts of blood to keep the sun moving and the rains falling. In the Mexica worldview, the city itself was sustained by this cycle, just as the chinampas were sustained by water and soil. The city also became a beacon of culture. Poets composed verses that celebrated both war and beauty. Flowers and songs, they called it, the highest expression of art. Warriors sought not only to kill but to capture, for captives provided both glory and nourishment for the gods. Women wove fine garments, raised families, and maintained the fabric of society. Children were taught discipline, devotion, and the skills of their station, for in Tenochtitlan every role mattered. As decades passed, the city's reputation grew. Travelers from across the Valley of Mexico came to trade in its markets, to marvel at its temples, to whisper about its rising power. Though still under the shadow of the mighty Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, the Mexica were no longer dismissed as swamp dwellers. Their city gleamed with purpose, their warriors were feared, their priests respected, and all the while, the population swelled. By the mid-15th century, tens of thousands lived upon the island, their homes rising higher, their gardens stretching farther into the lake. The sight of Tenochtitlan at dawn, the sun rising over the mountains, its light reflected in canals, its temples silhouetted against the sky, was said to be breathtaking. The Spaniards, when they finally saw it centuries later, would compare it to Venice, a city of water and wonder. As you rest now, imagine drifting through one of those early canals. The water is calm, carrying your canoe between rows of chinampas, thick with maize and flowers. Dragonflies hover, and the scent of earth and blossoms fills the air. Ahead, the Great Pyramid rises, its steps crowded with worshippers, its twin shrines reaching toward the heavens. Around you, the hum of the market, the laughter of children, the chants of priests, a city alive, a city becoming. This was Tenochtitlan in its youth, not yet the seat of empire, not yet the jewel of Mesoamerica, but already a marvel of ingenuity and determination, a city born of prophecy, sustained by faith, and built by hands that refused to surrender to swamp or scorn. The Mexica had taken root, their city stood firm, and though the Tepanecs still ruled the valley, the day would soon come when Tenochtitlan would rise against them, not as servant, but as rival. The builders were becoming warriors once more, and destiny waited just beyond the horizon. For now, as you drift deeper into sleep, let the image of this young city rest in your mind, the waters of the lake shimmering, the gardens floating, the temples rising. The Mexica had built their home. Soon they would build an empire. By the early 15th century, Tenochtitlan had become more than an island of reeds and gardens. Its canals bustled with canoes, its markets overflowed with trade, and its temples rose proudly toward the sky. Yet for all its growing splendor, the Mexica still lived under the shadow of Azcapotzalco, the mighty Tepanec capital. Azcapotzalco was a city of power and intimidation, ruled by the formidable Tezozomoc. Under his leadership, the Tepanecs dominated the Valley of Mexico, demanding tribute from nearly every city, and the Mexica were among their tributaries. They paid their dues with goods, labor, and warriors, serving as loyal mercenaries in the Tepanec armies. In return, they gained protection and occasional rewards, but always remained subordinate, their ambitions tightly bound by Tepanec might. Yet power, like all things, is fragile. In 1426, Tezozomoc died, leaving the Tepanec throne to his son, Maxtla. Where Tezozomoc had been shrewd and pragmatic, Maxtla was arrogant and suspicious. He distrusted the Mexica, resented their growing influence, and treated them with contempt. He imposed heavier tribute, insulted their envoys, and finally ordered the assassination of their leader, Chimalpopoca. The Mexica mourned their fallen Tlatoani, their speaker, their king, but mourning soon turned to anger. Under their new ruler, Itzcoatl, they began to plot rebellion. Yet they knew they could not face the Tepanecs alone. To topple Azcapotzalco, they would need allies. It was then that they turned to Texcoco, the eastern power, home of poets, scholars, and engineers. Texcoco, too, had suffered under Tepanec dominance, and its young prince Nezahualcóyotl, brilliant, cultured, and ambitious, longed to avenge his father, who had been slain by the Tepanecs years before. A secret pact was struck. Tenochtitlan and Texcoco would unite their forces against Azcapotzalco. To strengthen their chances, they also brought in a third partner, Tlacopan, a smaller city but strategically positioned and eager to share in the spoils of victory. Thus was born the Triple Alliance, an agreement of three cities bound by necessity, ambition, and a vision of overthrowing their oppressor. In 1428, war erupted. The Tepanecs, confident in their superiority, marched out to crush the rebellion. But this time, the Mexica were not mercenaries fighting for another's glory. They were warriors fighting for their own survival, their own destiny. Alongside their Texcocan allies, they struck hard and fast. Battles raged across the valley, on causeways and in fields, until at last the Tepanec capital itself was besieged. Azcapotzalco, once the unshakable master of the valley, fell. Its palaces were torn down, its power shattered, its dominance erased. The Tepanecs, who had ruled with fear, were no more. In their place, the Triple Alliance stood triumphant. The victory was more than political. It was a transformation. The Mexica, once scorned as swamp dwellers and servants, now shared in the mantle of supremacy. They were no longer tributaries. They were rulers. The alliance divided the spoils of conquest. Tribute from defeated cities would be collected and shared. 2 parts for Tenochtitlan, 2 parts for Texcoco, and 1 part for Tlacopan. This arrangement reflected both fairness and foresight, but in time, Tenochtitlan would come to dominate the partnership, its star rising higher than either of its allies. Under Itzcoatl's rule, the Mexica solidified their new power. He ordered the destruction of old codices, the painted histories that remembered their humiliating past as wanderers and mercenaries. In their place, new histories were written, painting the Mexica as chosen by the gods, destined from the beginning to rule the Valley of Mexico. The past was reshaped, myth and memory woven together to serve the future. Itzcoatl also reformed the city itself. Canals were expanded, causeways strengthened, and temples rebuilt. The sacred precinct grew ever grander, its pyramids rising higher. Warriors who had proven themselves in battle were rewarded with land, honors, and the right to wear the distinctive costumes of their rank. Society became more stratified, more ordered, as the Mexica embraced the role of imperial power. At the same time, their religious devotion deepened. Victories in battle meant captives, and captives meant sacrifices to the gods. The temples of Tenochtitlan echoed with chants and drums, the ceremonies binding the city ever more closely to its divine patrons. To the Mexica, this was not cruelty but duty. Just as the gods had given their blood to set the sun in motion, so too must humans offer blood to keep it alive. Each conquest, each sacrifice, was part of a cosmic cycle that sustained the world. As you imagine this moment, picture the Valley of Mexico transformed. Where once the Tepanecs ruled, now the banners of the Triple Alliance flew. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan stood united, their armies triumphant, their coffers filling with tribute. The Mexica, once despised, now held the future in their hands. The fall of Azcapotzalco was the turning point. From here, the empire would grow rapidly, stretching its influence far beyond the valley, reaching mountains and coasts, jungles and deserts. But even as power expanded outward, the heart of the empire remained the island city, the place of the eagle and cactus, where prophecy had taken root. As you drift deeper into rest, let yourself float upon the waters of Lake Texcoco, the night calm and still. The stars reflect on the surface, as if the heavens themselves are doubled. In the distance, the fires of celebration glow in Tenochtitlan, drums echoing across the lake, voices rising in triumph. A new order has begun. The Triple Alliance has been forged, and the Mexica are no longer wanderers, no longer servants. They are masters of their destiny, and their empire is only beginning. With the fall of Azcapotzalco and the birth of the Triple Alliance, the Valley of Mexico entered a new era. The Mexica of Tenochtitlan, alongside their partners in Texcoco and Tlacopan, stood as victors, their banners lifted high above the ruins of their former overlords. Yet victory was only the beginning, for what they built in the aftermath was not merely a coalition but an empire of tribute, wealth, and fear. The logic of this empire was simple, yet relentless. Conquered city-states were not always destroyed. Instead, they were bound into a system of obligation. Tribute lists were drawn up, specifying exactly what each subject community must deliver. Cacao beans from the hot southern lands, cotton cloth woven with dazzling colors, feathers of the quetzal and hummingbird, obsidian blades, jade ornaments, maize, beans, salt, honey, and above all, captives for sacrifice. 3 times a year, tribute caravans wound their way into Tenochtitlan. Imagine the scene. Lines of porters carrying baskets, bundles and cages, nobles in feathered cloaks escorting the offerings, scribes recording every item upon painted codices. Pyramids of maize rose in the plazas. Stacks of fine cotton mantles, too many to count, filled storehouses. Exotic birds with bright plumage squawked from cages, destined for the royal aviary. All of it testified to the reach of Aztec power, the steady flow of wealth from the periphery to the center. And at the very heart of that system stood Tenochtitlan, gleaming ever brighter with the fruits of conquest. Its markets swelled with goods from every corner of Mesoamerica. A visitor could find cacao from Chiapas, turquoise from the deserts to the north, jaguar pelts from the jungles, and salt from coastal flats. Traders, known as Pochteca, carried not only goods but also intelligence, acting as merchants and spies, mapping the lands that might one day fall under Aztec rule. But tribute was not just economic. It was also psychological, a constant reminder to subject peoples that the Mexica and their gods demanded obedience. The flow of goods reinforced hierarchy, the Triple Alliance at the top, everyone else below. Tribute was the lifeblood of empire, feeding not just markets but also temples, palaces, and armies. Yet beneath this grandeur, discontent simmered. For the conquered, tribute was a heavy burden. Whole communities were tasked with weaving cloth, growing maize, or raising warriors not for their own prosperity, but to satisfy the demands of Tenochtitlan. Many resented the endless flow of goods leaving their homes, knowing that refusal meant war, destruction, and worse. Resentment would never disappear. It lingered quietly, waiting for its chance. The Aztecs, however, believed tribute was more than politics. To them, it was cosmic. Every battle, every conquest, every offering of captives and goods was part of their sacred duty to sustain the sun. The gods had nourished creation with their own sacrifices, and now the Mexica repaid the debt with the lifeblood of their enemies. Tribute was not only power, it was balance, keeping the fifth sun alive. To sustain this system, war became ritualized. Campaigns were launched every year, carefully planned according to the sacred calendar. Aztec armies marched in bright costumes, drums beating, banners fluttering. Warriors sought not to slaughter but to capture, for captives were more valuable than corpses. To seize a foe alive and drag him back to Tenochtitlan was the highest mark of honor. Such captives would later climb the steep steps of the temple pyramid, their hearts offered to the gods as the drums thundered and the people sang. In this way, conquest and ritual fused into a single cycle. Tribute brought goods, war brought captives, sacrifices fed the gods. The gods ensured the sun rose again, and the sun rising gave strength to the Mexica to conquer more lands. On and on, the circle turned. As the empire grew, Tenochtitlan itself was transformed. Palaces expanded, their courtyards filled with nobles dressed in brilliant feathers and jade. Temples multiplied, their pyramids towering ever higher. The central plaza became a stage for ceremonies that gathered thousands, uniting the city in devotion and awe. Even commoners who labored in chinampas and workshops shared pride in the empire's splendor. Though they bore heavy responsibilities, they also knew their city was becoming the greatest in the world they knew. And yet, the empire's brilliance carried shadows. The demand for tribute pushed communities to exhaustion. The demand for captives made war endless and peace fleeting. The Triple Alliance was not a harmonious partnership forever. Tenochtitlan, by far the strongest of the three, began to overshadow Texcoco and Tlacopan, taking a greater share of tribute and glory. The balance of power tilted, and jealousy brewed even among allies. Still, for now the system held. Tribute flowed, temples stood tall, and the empire seemed unstoppable. To outsiders, the Mexica appeared destined by the gods, their power sanctioned by the sun itself. To the Mexica themselves, every conquest confirmed the truth of their prophecy, that they were chosen, that the eagle and cactus had marked them for greatness. As you rest tonight, imagine the sight of one of those tribute caravans entering Tenochtitlan. The lake shimmers around the causeway, canoes gliding alongside the marchers. Drums beat in the distance, welcoming the procession. Porters stagger under the weight of cacao cloth and jade. Nobles stride proudly, banners fluttering in the breeze. At the end of the journey, the goods are heaped before the temples, tall pyramids painted with sacred colors. The city is alive with sound and movement, wealth and worship, power and fear. The empire of tribute was both magnificent and fragile. It made Tenochtitlan glitter like a jewel, yet it also sowed the seeds of resentment that would one day be turned against it. For now, though, the system worked. The Mexica had risen from swamp dwellers to rulers of a vast dominion, and the sun, nourished by their offerings, still rose each day above the Valley of Mexico. The wanderers were now emperors. Their city stood at the center of a world bound by tribute, their gods fed by sacrifice, their destiny confirmed with every conquest. The empire of tribute had begun, and for a time it seemed eternal. To understand the Aztec world, you must enter the sacred rhythm that pulsed at its heart. The Mexica believed they lived in the fifth sun, an age born from the sacrifice of gods, fragile and impermanent, kept alive only through human devotion. For them, the rising of the sun each morning was not guaranteed. It was a victory, purchased by offerings of blood. Without sacrifice, the sky might remain dark, the earth cold, the cycle broken forever. This belief shaped every corner of their lives. Warfare was not only politics, not only conquest for tribute and land, it was a holy duty. Captives taken in battle were not merely prisoners, they were gifts chosen to sustain the sun itself. The Mexica called their wars Xochiaoyotl, flower wars, because they yielded the most precious flower of all, the captive to be offered on the temple steps. Picture the sacred precinct at the center of Tenochtitlan. Rising above all was the Templo Mayor, the great temple, its twin stairways climbing steeply to two shrines at the top. One shrine honored Tlaloc, god of rain, whose waters brought crops and life. The other honored Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, whose power demanded blood. From the base of the pyramid to its summit, every stone, every carving, every painted glyph proclaimed devotion to the divine. Here the ceremonies unfolded. Drums boomed, their sound carrying across the lake. Conch shells echoed, calling the people to gather. Priests, clad in black robes and headdresses of feathers and jaguar skins, ascended the stairs. Captives were led upward, sometimes adorned with feathers and painted in bright colors, honored in death as offerings to the gods. Onlookers crowded the plaza, chanting prayers, raising their hands to the sky. At the summit, the moment of sacrifice came. To the Mexica, this was not cruelty, but cosmic necessity. Just as the gods had once shed their own blood to set the sun in motion, now humans repaid that debt. With obsidian blades sharper than steel, the priests opened the chest, lifted the still-beating heart toward the sky, and offered it to the rising sun. The body, lifeless but honored, was cast down the temple steps, its energy believed to return to the earth. To us, such rituals may seem harsh, but to the Mexica they were acts of devotion, the very center of existence. Without them, the world itself could collapse. Sacrifice was woven into every festival, every calendar ritual, every victory in battle. It was a rhythm of giving and receiving, life and death, bound to the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Not all sacrifices were the same. Some honored Tlaloc, the rain god. In these ceremonies, children were sometimes chosen, their tears believed to bring rain to the fields. Others honored Tziptotec, the flayed lord, symbol of renewal in rituals of skinning and rebirth. Still others honored Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, with offerings of warriors who embodied him for a year, living like gods before their final sacrifice. The sacred calendar dictated these ceremonies. The Tonalpa Huali, a cycle of 260 days, marked the rhythm of festivals, each day tied to a god, a number, a destiny. Alongside it, the Chiupahuali, a solar calendar of 365 days, structured the agricultural year. Together they guided when wars were launched, when crops were sown, when ceremonies took place. Life was a web of time and duty, every action aligned with cosmic cycles. Even common people participated in this sacred rhythm. Farmers offered the first maize of the harvest. Families pierced their ears or tongues to draw blood, giving small offerings of their own life force. Warriors trained tirelessly, for their greatest honor was to die in sacrifice or battle, their spirits destined to join the sun in its journey across the sky. Women too had their sacred role. Those who died in childbirth were honored as equals to fallen warriors, their spirits believed to accompany the sun at dawn. This constant awareness of cosmic fragility gave Aztec society both urgency and grandeur. To live was to serve the gods, to nourish creation with devotion. Every feast, every battle, every ceremony was a thread in the tapestry of sustaining the universe. Yet the demand for sacrifice was also the empire's burden. The need for captives drove endless warfare, pushing Aztec armies farther and farther from the Valley of Mexico. It fueled resentment among conquered peoples who saw their sons and daughters taken to die in the plazas of Tenochtitlan. Tribute may have kept the markets alive, but sacrifice kept fear alive. Still, within Tenochtitlan itself, the system created unity. Festivals filled the calendar, drawing people together in celebration and awe. The Feast of Toxcatl, honoring Tezcatlipoca, lasted a full year of preparation, culminating in the sacrifice of a young man who had lived as the god's embodiment. The new fire ceremony, held every 52 years when the two calendars aligned, saw every fire in the valley extinguished, plunging the world into darkness until priests rekindled the flame on the chest of a sacrificial victim. When the fire was carried back to the city and new torches lit, the people rejoiced, for the world had been renewed. Imagine yourself in Tenochtitlan during such a festival. The entire city alive with anticipation, streets filled with dancers in feathered costumes, musicians pounding drums, children laughing, nobles in cloaks of jade and turquoise watching from balconies. As night falls, the stars gleam above the dark lake, mirrored in its waters. At the temple, firelight flickers, smoke rises, chants echo. The people look upward, not in dread, but in trust. Trust that the gods will accept their offerings, that the sun will rise again, that life will continue for another day. As you sink deeper into rest, picture the sacred precinct at night. Torches glowing along the steps of the Templo Mayor, the lake around the city silent and still. Beyond the marshes and mountains lies a vast empire, but here, at the center, the heartbeat of ritual sustains all. To the Mexica, this was the meaning of existence, to give life so that life might endure. Theirs was an empire built not only of stone and tribute, but of faith and sacrifice. In their eyes they did not kill for cruelty, but for creation. Every drop of blood was a prayer, every offering a promise, every heart lifted skyward a gift to the sun. And so, day after day, year after year, the cycle continued. The sun rose, the people worked, the warriors fought, the priests offered, the gods received. The fifth sun endured, for a time. By the middle of the 15th century, the marshy island where the Mexica once built their reed huts had become something far greater, a city of water and stone, a place of brilliance and order, a wonder that seemed to float upon the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco. This was Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Valley of Mexico, the heart of an empire, and one of the most extraordinary cities the world has ever known. Visitors who arrived by causeway or canoe often gasped at the sight before them. The city stretched wide across the lake, its canals glistening in the sun, its temples rising like mountains of stone. At the center stood the Templo Mayor, the great temple, its twin shrines painted red and blue dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Around it, a sacred precinct enclosed by walls held dozens of other temples, shrines, ball courts, and schools for priests. The very heart of Tenochtitlan was not a palace, not a market, but a space of devotion, for to the Mexica, religion and life were inseparable. But outside the sacred precinct, the city bustled with the rhythm of daily life. Markets thrived, the largest of them at Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister city to the north. Here, thousands gathered each day to buy and sell. Imagine walking through its rows of stalls, baskets overflowing with maize and beans, piles of tomatoes, chilies and avocados, cacao beans used as currency-changing hands, bright feathers displayed like jewels, obsidian knives sharp as razors, cotton cloth dyed in vivid colors, and exotic goods brought from faraway lands, jade, turquoise, rubber, jaguar pelts. The air was filled with the calls of merchants, the clatter of trade, the hum of languages from across the empire. So vast was the market that the Spaniards, when they later saw it, said it surpassed anything in Europe. And yet it was not chaos. Judges and officials patrolled the stalls, ensuring fairness, punishing cheats and recording trade. It was a place of order as well as abundance, the lifeblood of the city's economy. The city's neighborhoods, called calpulli, gave structure to society. Each calpulli was a community within the larger city, with its own temple, schools, and leaders. Here, commoners farmed chinampas, raised families, and trained their young. Boys learned farming, fishing, and basic warfare. Girls learned weaving, cooking, and the sacred duties of the household. Yet education did not end there. At the age of 15, children entered formal schools, the Calmacac for nobles and priests, the Telpochcali for commoners. In these institutions, they learned discipline, religion, history, and the arts of war. To the Mexica, education was not a privilege but a duty, for every citizen had a role in sustaining the empire. Above the commoners stood the nobles, the pipiltin, who served as judges, generals, and priests. They lived in larger houses, wore finer clothes, and enjoyed privileges in law and ceremony. Yet their wealth came with obligations to lead in battle, to guide in governance, to sponsor festivals and feasts. At the very top stood the Tlatoani, the speaker, ruler of Tenochtitlan. His word was law, his image sacred, his power balanced by councils of nobles, but elevated by divine sanction. To him flowed the tribute of the empire, and from him radiated both justice and command. Daily life in Tenochtitlan was rich with order and beauty. Farmers paddled canoes to their chinampas. Where maize and flowers grew in neat rows upon the water, artisans carved statues of gods and animals from obsidian and stone. Women spun cotton and wove cloaks embroidered with dazzling designs. Warriors trained in the courtyards, practicing with spears, shields, and atlatls, the spear throwers that gave their darts deadly force. Children played with toy figurines or practiced games that prepared them for the discipline of adulthood. Even leisure carried sacred meaning. The ball game, played on special courts, echoed with thuds and cheers. Yet its rules were bound to myth, symbolizing the eternal struggle between day and night, life and death. Music filled the city, drums and flutes and rattles accompanying dances in plazas. Poetry too flourished, verses of love, war, and philosophy sung by nobles and commoners alike. "We only borrow this earth," sang the poets, reflecting on the fragility of life beneath the fifth sun. And always above the city rose the temples, reminding all that life's purpose was to sustain the gods. Rituals marked the passing of days, months, and years. Festivals filled the calendar, each honoring a different deity. Entire neighborhoods prepared costumes, songs, and offerings, uniting the city in devotion. The smell of copal incense drifted through the air, its smoke curling upward like prayers. The grandeur of Tenochtitlan astonished even those who lived there. Aqueducts carried fresh spring water across the lake into the city, feeding fountains and pools. Dikes and levees managed the waters of Texcoco, protecting the Chinampas from floods. Causeways linked the island to the mainland, wide enough for armies to march in or caravans to bring tribute. Bridges could be lifted in times of danger, turning the city into a fortress surrounded by water. To approach Tenochtitlan at sunrise was to see a city of light floating on the lake, a vision of human ingenuity and divine favor. Yet beneath its order and splendor, the city carried tension. Its beauty was built upon tribute from conquered peoples, its rituals upon the blood of captives. The wealth that filled its markets, the maize that fed its people, the feathers and jewels that adorned its nobles, all came from lands beyond, from subjects who obeyed not by choice but by fear. Tenochtitlan glittered like a jewel, but jewels are hard, and they cut. Still, for those who walked its streets, the city was the center of the universe. Its temples touched the heavens, its causeways reached the earth, its canals mirrored the stars. To live in Tenochtitlan was to live at the heart of creation, in the city chosen by prophecy, blessed by gods, sustained by sacrifice. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the sounds of that city at twilight, the splash of paddles in the canals, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants closing their stalls, the distant beating of drums at the temple as smoke rises into the night sky. The waters of the lake are calm, reflecting the stars. The city glows with firelight, alive yet serene, splendor resting upon the surface of the earth like a dream. This was Tenochtitlan at its height, a city of brilliance, of order, of devotion. Soon it would become the capital of an empire that stretched across mountains and coasts, jungles and deserts. But here, in the stillness of the night, it was simply itself, the city of the eagle and cactus, the city of gods and men, the city that dreamed itself eternal. By the dawn of the 16th century, the empire of the Mexica had reached its widest horizon. From the valleys and lakes of central Mexico, its power stretched outward, like the rays of the sun itself, to the forests of Oaxaca, to the fertile plains of the Gulf Coast, to the distant mountains and deserts beyond. Tribute flowed endlessly into Tenochtitlan, and the city shone brighter than ever, a capital of wealth, ritual, and power. At its helm stood a ruler whose name has echoed through history, Moctezuma II. Moctezuma was crowned Tlatoani, the Speaker, the king, in the year 1502. Tall, regal, and deeply devout, he carried himself with the dignity of both a priest and a warrior. His rule marked the height of Aztec power, but also the stirrings of unease. For while the empire expanded outward, gathering riches and glory, shadows gathered at its heart. Moctezuma's reign began with triumphs. Campaigns carried Aztec armies farther than ever before. Towns and provinces once beyond reach were brought into the fold, their people bound to the empire through tribute and fear. From the hot, humid coasts came cacao, vanilla, and cotton. From the jungles came jaguar pelts and quetzal feathers. From the mountains came obsidian and gold. The variety and abundance of tribute dazzled even those who lived in Tenochtitlan. Markets overflowed with goods from hundreds of miles away, and the palace storehouses groaned under the weight of riches. But empire was not built only on material wealth. It was also built on ritual. Moctezuma, perhaps more than any ruler before him, emphasized the sacred duties of kingship. He was a deeply religious man, devoted to the gods, especially Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god who had guided the Mexica from their wandering days. Moctezuma oversaw grand festivals, expanded temples, and insisted on ever more sacrifices to ensure the favor of the heavens. To him, conquest was not merely politics, it was destiny, a divine mandate to nourish the cosmos. In his court, Moctezuma surrounded himself with splendor and ceremony. Nobles entered his presence barefoot, bowing low, their eyes averted from his face. Courtiers whispered that he seldom touched the ground with his own feet, carried in a litter when he traveled through the city. His meals were served on plates of gold, his cloak woven of the finest cotton, his headdress adorned with feathers that shimmered like the rainbow. And yet, for all this magnificence, he remained austere, a ruler who fasted and prayed, who sought omens in the stars, who feared that destiny was fragile. The burdens of empire grew heavier with each passing year. Conquered peoples chafed under the endless demands for tribute. The wars that brought captives for sacrifice also brought resentment and exhaustion. While Tenochtitlan grew rich, distant provinces grew weary. Among the fiercest of these discontented neighbors were the Tlaxcalans, a small but proud people to the east, who resisted Aztec conquest with defiance. They waged war after war against the Mexica, refusing to bend. For Moctezuma, their resistance was both an obstacle and a necessity, for the wars against Tlaxcala provided a steady flow of captives, fueling the rituals that kept the fifth sun alive. And yet, even as the empire seemed secure, omens unsettled the people. Strange signs appeared in the sky, a comet blazing across the heavens, a column of fire rising at night. Lake Texcoco boiled and flooded, damaging houses and temples. A voice was said to cry out in the darkness, warning that disaster was coming. Priests and soothsayers whispered of prophecies of gods who might return, of endings that might arrive sooner than expected. Moctezuma listened. He was a man of power, but also of doubt, haunted by the weight of his people's destiny. He strengthened the temples, doubled the rituals, and demanded more sacrifices than ever, hoping to secure the gods' favor against whatever storms might come. Yet the omens did not fade. Imagine the city at this time, glittering with its wealth, yet uneasy beneath its splendor. The markets of Tlatelolco still bustled, the canals still shimmered with canoes, the temples still rose in glory. But in the sacred precinct, the drums beat louder, the incense smoke rose thicker, and the ceremonies grew more urgent. The gods, it seemed, were hungry. Moctezuma himself became more distant, more wrapped in ritual. He sought solitude in prayer, his face shadowed by worry. To his people he was still a figure of awe, but also of mystery. His rule, less a voice of command and more an echo of prophecy. He ruled at the empire's zenith, but he ruled also at its threshold. For just beyond the horizon changes were coming, unlike any the Mexica had ever faced. As you rest, picture Tenochtitlan at twilight in Moctezuma's reign. The lake glows with the fading light of day, the pyramids stand tall and the city hums with life. But in the palace, the ruler prays by torchlight, gazing into the night sky, searching for answers in the stars. His empire stretches wide, his city shines with splendor, but in his heart he feels the tremors of fate. The Aztec Empire had reached its height, magnificent and immense. And yet, as often happens in the stories of great powers, the moment of greatest triumph stood closest to the moment of greatest peril. For beyond the mountains, across the sea, strangers were sailing closer, drawn by winds and ambition, ready to step into this world of gods and warriors. The age of Moctezuma's glory was also the age of waiting, for destiny, for prophecy, for the arrival of forces that would change the empire forever. The year was 1519, and the empire of the Mexica stood in splendor. Tenochtitlan gleamed like a jewel upon the waters of Lake Texcoco, its markets overflowing, its temples towering, its armies feared across mountains and jungles. Yet on distant shores, across the vast ocean, a new force had begun to stir. Ships unlike anything the Mexica had ever imagined approached the coast, their sails white as clouds, their hulls towering like floating mountains. From them came strangers, pale-skinned, bearded, clad in shining metal. The people of the Valley of Mexico would soon call them Tules, gods or demons, for their arrival seemed like the fulfillment of prophecy. These strangers were Spaniards, led by Hernán Cortés, a man of ambition, cunning, and steel. With him came fewer than 600 soldiers, but they carried weapons the Mexica had never seen. Muskets that thundered with smoke and fire, crossbows that pierced with deadly accuracy, and above all, horses tall, powerful beasts unknown in the Americas, which to the Mexica seemed like monsters with two heads, man and animal, fused into one. News of their arrival spread quickly through the coastal towns. Moctezuma, in Tenochtitlan, received reports with unease. He had heard whispers of prophecies, of pale-skinned visitors who might be linked to Quetzalcoatl, the ancient feathered serpent god said to one day return. Were these strangers gods, messengers, or invaders cloaked in omens? Cortés wasted no time. He marched inland from the coast of Veracruz, gathering allies, sowing fear and exploiting resentment. For while the Aztec Empire was mighty, it was also brittle. Many of the peoples forced to pay tribute to Tenochtitlan bore deep resentment. They longed for freedom, for revenge against the empire that demanded their goods and their captives. Cortés, sharp-eyed, recognized this discontent as his greatest weapon. Among his most important allies became the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who had long resisted Aztec conquest. At first they fought the Spaniards fiercely, but when Cortés proved his strength, they struck an alliance. Together, Spaniards and Tlaxcalans marched toward the heart of the empire. Cortés promised them liberation from Aztec tribute, while secretly plotting to replace one master with another. As the invaders moved inland, they were aided by interpreters. Chief among them was Malintzin, also called La Malinche, a woman of intelligence and skill who spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Mayan. Through her, Cortés could communicate, negotiate, deceive, and command. To the Spaniards, she was indispensable. To the Mexica, she became a figure of fate, later remembered as both traitor and mother of a new world. Moctezuma watched these movements with growing dread. Reports told of strange weapons, of cities falling to these newcomers, of allies flocking to their side. He sent gifts of gold and feathers to Cortés, hoping to appease him, to perhaps persuade him to turn back. But the gifts only deepened Spanish desire, for they revealed the wealth of the empire. Cortés pressed on. Finally, in November of 1519, the strangers arrived at the causeways of Tenochtitlan. Imagine the scene: the Spaniards, armored and armed, riding their horses, their cannons and muskets glinting in the sun. Alongside them, thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. Before them, the lake stretching wide, and in its center the shining city. To them, it must have seemed like a dream, a city of palaces and pyramids rising from the water, greater than anything they had seen in Spain. And to the Mexica, their arrival was like a vision from prophecy. Moctezuma, torn between fear and reverence, chose to welcome them. He went out to meet Cortés in procession, dressed in rich garments, his nobles at his side. The emperor and the conquistador met on the causeway, two worlds colliding in a single moment. Cortés, bold, embraced him. Moctezuma, cautious, offered gifts and words of welcome. For a time it seemed as though diplomacy might prevail. The Spaniards were housed within the city, guests yet also captives of their own ambition. They marveled at the markets of Tlatelolco, at the canals and causeways, at the palaces and temples. They wrote in awe of the order and splendor of Tenochtitlan, declaring it rivaled and surpassed the greatest cities of Europe. Yet beneath their admiration burned desire for wealth, for conquest, for power. Moctezuma treated them with ceremony, but his people grew uneasy. Why did their ruler bow to these strangers? Why did he shower them with gifts instead of casting them out? Whispers grew in the streets, murmurs of discontent. The balance of power within the city began to tremble. And so the strangers remained, neither allies nor enemies, but something more dangerous, guests at the heart of an empire they already plotted to undo. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the sight of Tenochtitlan at this moment of fragile peace. The sun sets over Lake Texcoco, painting the waters gold. The Spaniards stand on balconies, gazing at the canals alive with canoes. Moctezuma prays in the temple, searching the heavens for guidance. The people murmur in the markets, uneasy, uncertain, watching these men of iron and thunder walk their streets. The eagle and the cactus had marked the Mexica as chosen, and their empire had risen higher than any before in this land. But now, on the causeways of Tenochtitlan, two worlds faced one another, one born of prophecy and sacrifice, the other of steel and conquest. Their meeting was not the end, but the beginning, and the future would be written in fire, blood, and silence. The Spaniards had entered Tenochtitlan as honored guests, welcomed with ceremony and awe. Yet beneath the splendor of that meeting lay unease, a tension like storm clouds building on the horizon. For the Mexica and the Spaniards were not merely two peoples, but two worlds, and worlds cannot long exist in the same space without collision. At first, Moctezuma sought balance. He offered the strangers gifts of gold and jade, believing that generosity might soothe their ambitions. He housed them in palaces, allowed them to wander the markets, to gaze upon the temples, to marvel at the grandeur of his city. But the Spaniards did not see gifts as tokens of goodwill. They saw them as signs of weakness, as invitations to take more. Cortés, ambitious and calculating, soon acted. He feared rebellion, feared the Mexica might rise against his small band of soldiers. To secure his position, he took the boldest step imaginable. He seized Moctezuma himself. The emperor, once untouchable, was now a captive in his own palace. And so began a strange and fragile time when the ruler of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica lived as a prisoner under foreign guard. Moctezuma still appeared before his people, still spoke as their king, but now his words were shadowed by the presence of Spanish swords at his side. To some, he seemed a puppet, to others, still sacred. But doubt spread, and loyalty wavered. Meanwhile, the Spaniards grew ever more brazen. They demanded tribute of their own, stripping gold from temples, melting ornaments into ingots. They desecrated shrines, angering the priests. And when a great festival approached, the Feast of Toxcatl, they allowed the celebrations to begin only to strike. Fearing rebellion, the Spaniards attacked the unarmed celebrants in the temple plaza, cutting down nobles and warriors alike in a massacre of blood. The city erupted. The Mexica rose in fury, seizing weapons, hurling stones and spears from rooftops, cutting off the causeways to trap the invaders. The streets filled with the sounds of battle, drums beating, conch shells blaring, cries echoing through the canals. The Spaniards, once welcomed, were now enemies surrounded on all sides. In desperation, they turned to Moctezuma. They pushed him to speak to his people, to calm them, to command them to cease their assault. Weak and torn, Moctezuma appeared before the crowd, his voice carrying across the plaza. But the people no longer listened. Some accounts say they hurled stones and arrows, striking their king. Others say he was killed by his captors. However it happened, the truth was clear. Moctezuma, once the living symbol of the Mexica, was dead. His death marked the breaking of the fragile peace, the final shattering of the illusion that two worlds might coexist. Now the Spaniards' only choice was to flee. They gathered their gold, their weapons, their wounded, and under the cover of night, they attempted escape across the causeways. But the Mexica were ready. Canoes filled the lake, warriors swarmed the bridges, arrows and spears rained down from the darkness. The causeways became a battlefield of chaos and despair. Men drowned under the weight of stolen treasure. Horses tumbled into the lake. Soldiers fell screaming into the waters, dragged down by warriors or swallowed by the depths. The night was filled with fire and death. The Spaniards would remember it forever as the Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Few survived. Cortés, wounded and bitter, led the remnants of his force away from the lake, through swamps and hostile lands, fleeing for their lives. Yet even in defeat he did not abandon his ambition. He regrouped, sought new allies, and plotted his return. For he understood that while the Mexica were fierce, they were also surrounded by enemies. And those enemies were willing to see Tenochtitlan fall. Back in the city, the Mexica grieved their king, but they also rejoiced in victory. They had driven out the strangers, cast them from their sacred city. Their temples still stood, their gods still ruled, their empire still breathed. Yet the cost had been great, and the danger not gone. The Spaniards had not vanished. They would return, and when they did, they would not come alone. As you rest, imagine Tenochtitlan in the days after the Night of Sorrows. The canals are quiet again, but beneath the silence lies vigilance. Warriors sharpen obsidian blades, priests prepare rituals, families whisper prayers to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The city has endured, but the shadow of the strangers still lingers at the edge of the horizon. The clash of empires had begun. The Mexica had struck a mighty blow, but their enemies were not defeated. Across the mountains, Cortés was gathering strength, forging alliances, preparing for a siege that would decide the fate of the empire itself. The eagle still perched upon the cactus, but its wings were troubled by the storm winds gathering all around. The Spaniards had fled Tenochtitlan, bloodied and broken, their treasure scattered in the waters of Lake Texcoco. The Mexica had celebrated their triumph, believing the gods had turned back the strangers. Yet victory was fleeting, for in the wake of the Night of Sorrows came an enemy more terrible than any weapon of steel or horse of war. It arrived unseen, carried by breath and touch, invisible and relentless. The Mexica called it Huitzilopochtli, the Great Rash. We know it as smallpox. It swept through Tenochtitlan like fire through dry reeds, striking nobles and commoners alike. Entire families sickened and died. Priests could not perform their rituals. Warriors could not lift their weapons. In a city of tens of thousands, the disease claimed countless lives. Even Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's successor, fell to it. The empire was wounded, its strength diminished, even as Cortés rebuilt his own. He had not abandoned his ambition. With the survivors of his army, with reinforcements from the coast, and with thousands of indigenous allies, Tlaxcalans above all, he returned to the valley. Now he came not as a guest, but as a conqueror, determined to end the Mexica once and for all. The year was 1521, and the siege of Tenochtitlan began. Cortés built brigantines, small warships, and launched them upon the lake. With these, he cut off the city's supply lines, destroying canoes, seizing control of the waters. On land, his allies closed the causeways, blocking food and reinforcements. Slowly, the island city was strangled. Inside Tenochtitlan, a new leader rose. Cuauhtémoc, a young and valiant warrior chosen as Tlatoani. Brave, determined, he refused to surrender. Under his command, the Mexica fought with desperate courage. Day after day, they resisted assaults upon the causeways. They rebuilt barricades, set ambushes in the canals, hurled stones and arrows from rooftops. Women and children carried water, tended the wounded, and kept the city alive with their labor and prayers. But the siege was merciless. Hunger gnawed at the people. The chinampas lay ruined, the stores of maize dwindled. Disease still haunted the streets. The once bustling markets stood empty. Families boiled weeds for food, gnawed on leather, drank from brackish pools. Yet still they fought, for Tenochtitlan was not just a city, it was the very heart of their world, the place of prophecy, the dwelling of their gods. To abandon it was unthinkable. The Spaniards pressed harder. Their cannons roared, their brigantines patrolled the waters, their allies filled the causeways. Slowly, block by block, they advanced into the city, tearing down houses, widening streets to bring their horses inside. The Mexica countered fiercely, fighting from rooftops and canals, refusing to yield. The battle turned Tenochtitlan into a ruin of fire and rubble, each street contested, each canal choked with bodies. As the weeks dragged on, the city's grandeur collapsed. Palaces lay shattered, temples were toppled. The sacred precinct itself, once the proud heart of devotion, became a battlefield. Smoke rose above the lake, and the waters turned red with blood. Yet even as their world crumbled, the Mexica clung to courage. At last, after 80 days of siege, the end came. Cuauhtémoc, exhausted but unbroken, was captured as he tried to flee across the lake. When brought before Cortés, he is said to have spoken words of dignity. "I have done all that I could in defense of my city and my people. Now take this knife and end my life." But Cortés spared him not from mercy, but from a desire to use him as a symbol of victory. On August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The city of prophecy, the city of splendor, the city that had risen from reeds and mud to rule an empire, was no more. Its temples were in ruins, its streets filled with the dead, its people enslaved or scattered. The eagle still perched upon the cactus, but its wings were broken. For the Spaniards it was triumph. For the Mexica it was tragedy beyond words. A world had ended. The fifth sun, they believed, had been darkened not by the gods, but by strangers from across the sea. And yet, even in defeat, dignity endured. Cuauhtémoc remained a symbol of courage, remembered not for surrender but for his refusal to abandon his people. The Mexica, though conquered, carried their language, their traditions, their memories into the future. Their empire was gone, but their identity was not extinguished. As you rest, imagine the lake at dawn after the siege. Smoke still curls from the ruins. The waters ripple with silence. The cries of survivors echo faintly across the canals. The great city has fallen, yet the memory of its splendor remains, shimmering like a dream that cannot be erased. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not only the collapse of an empire, it was the meeting of worlds, one ending, another beginning, both forever changed. Out of its ashes, a new chapter of history would rise, one of mingling cultures, sorrows, and rebirth. But for the Mexica in that moment, it was simply the end of all they had known. The smoke of Tenochtitlan's fall had barely faded when the world began to change. Spanish banners rose over the ruins, their churches and palaces built upon the very stones of the sacred precinct. The once great capital of the Mexica lay shattered, yet its story did not end in silence. For though the empire had fallen, the spirit of its people endured, woven into the land, the language, and the memory of generations to come. The Spaniards sought to erase the old ways. Temples were toppled, idols shattered, rituals banned. New faith was imposed, new rulers crowned, new words taught. Yet the Mexica were not simply erased. Their language, Nahuatl, remained on the tongues of millions, shaping the sound of Mexico. Their foods maize, cacao, tomatoes, chilies spread across oceans, changing diets and cultures around the world. Their knowledge of farming, astronomy, and medicine persisted, often hidden beneath the surface but never forgotten. Even their symbols survived, transformed into emblems of identity. The eagle on the cactus, once the omen that led the Mexica to their island home, re-emerged centuries later as the centerpiece of Mexico's flag. What began as a sacred vision became a national emblem, uniting past and present in a single image of endurance. The legacy of the Mexica was also written in law and governance. Their empire had been a patchwork of tribute and alliances, their administration both strict and adaptable. Spanish rulers arriving with their own systems often adopted and adapted what the Aztecs had already built. Tribute lists, market regulations, divisions of land. In this way, the structures of empire did not vanish but continued under new masters, altered yet recognizable. Culturally, the Aztec vision of the world still lingers. Their poetry, preserved in fragments, speaks across centuries with haunting beauty, reflections on the brevity of life, the pursuit of truth, the inevitability of death. "We only borrow this earth," the poets wrote, and their words remain as timely now as they were when sung in the courts of Texcoco and Tenochtitlan. Their songs of flowers and war, of love and loss, remind us that even in an age of conquest and sacrifice, there was tenderness, longing, and a search for meaning. Spiritually, too, their legacy endures. Though the Spaniards sought to replace their gods with new faith, echoes of the old rituals survived. Festivals once dedicated to deities found new expression under saints' names. Ancient myths blended with Christian stories, creating a layered faith that carried traces of the past within the present. In villages and towns across Mexico, the pulse of the old gods can still be faintly heard beneath church bells. And perhaps most of all, their story remains as a lesson. The rise of the Mexica was a tale of resilience, of wanderers who became settlers, of settlers who became builders, of builders who became emperors. From swamp and reed, they raised a city that rivaled the greatest in the world. They forged an empire through courage, faith, and relentless determination. Yet their fall was just as swift, a reminder that even the mightiest can be undone by arrogance, by resentment, by forces beyond their imagining. The Aztec Empire was a paradox, both magnificent and fragile, devout and ruthless, creative and destructive. Its temples soared, but its rituals demanded blood. Its markets overflowed, but its tribute burdened the many for the wealth of the few. It was a civilization of brilliance and contradiction, a mirror of humanity itself, capable of greatness and cruelty, vision and downfall. As centuries passed, the ruins of Tenochtitlan gave way to Mexico City, built atop its bones. Yet beneath the streets, the stones of the great temple still lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. When they were unearthed in modern times, they reminded the world that the Aztecs had never truly vanished. Their city may have fallen, but their story endures in every word of Nahuatl still spoken, every maize field still planted, every symbol of eagle and cactus still raised. As you drift into rest, picture once more the image that began their journey. An eagle perched upon a cactus, serpent in its beak, shining beneath the sun. It was a vision that gave purpose to wanderers, that led them to build a city upon water, that inspired them to create an empire. It remains today, not as prophecy, but as memory, as identity, as a reminder of resilience. The Mexica dreamed of eternity, of sustaining the fifth sun with their devotion. Their empire did not last forever, yet in a way their dream was fulfilled. For their legacy has endured far beyond the fall of their temples, carried in language, in culture, in spirit, into the present. The story of the Aztecs is not only one of conquest and collapse. It is a story of survival, of how a people, though defeated, continued to shape the world long after their empire was gone. Their vision, their myths, their achievements, and their tragedies are threads woven into the great fabric of human history. And so, as you fall into sleep, remember them, the wanderers from Aztlan, the builders of Tenochtitlan, the emperors of tribute, the warriors of the sun. Their city may have been reduced to rubble, but their spirit endures in every dawn over Mexico, every heartbeat of its people, every story told of their rise and fall. The fifth sun still shines. The legacy of the Aztecs still lives.